Hello, today I'm joined by Dr. Becky Alexis-Martin. She's a lecturer in human geography at Manchester Metropolitan University. She's the author of this 2019 book. It's Disarming Doomsday, the human impact of nuclear weapons since Hiroshima. You've been awarded the LHM Ling Outstanding First Book Prize, I believe.
Yes, I have. It was a delight and a surprise, and it was really positive to get that recognition among my academic community. So it's lovely to be an opportunity actually to thank them while chatting to you.
And you've been shortlisted for the Bread and Rose Award in 2020 as well.
Yes.
So for people who aren't familiar with your work, could you just give us a bit of info into your background, who you are, why you're writing about what you're writing about?
Yeah, of course, no problem. So I'm quite an unusual academic, I guess. My background lies in the natural and environmental sciences, but I worked in emergency planning before I became an academic. So for my doctorate, I made a new spatiotemporal modelling framework for radiation emergency preparedness. So that's sort of like The Sims, but for nuclear accident. So it kind of shows the trajectories of different communities across a hypothetical city and gives this estimate for exposure likelihood over time. Being a fan of catchy titles, I called it RadPop. So if you ever want to read my PhD thesis, you're welcome, and it's out there. So it felt worthwhile. But while I was studying, I became more interested, more and more interested in these real life communities that have been impacted by nuclear issues. So while I was working on my PhD, I was lucky enough to win some extra funding, which allowed me to undertake two projects. One was called Nuclear Families, and it explored the lives and experiences, risk perception of the British nuclear test veteran community and their family. And the other one was called Atomic Atolls. It was designed to provide a post-colonial perspective and understanding of the Pacific and the Pacific nuclear weapon tests. And I did this because I wanted to get a better understanding of these communities. So my academic research has taken me across the world. I've been everywhere from the US to Fiji, to Australia, and to Kiribati or Kirisimas in the centre of the Pacific Ocean, to try and learn about the spatialities, the inequalities, the injustices, and the neglected communities who are still affected by historic nuclear weapon tests. So it's important to me being able to amplify their voices and speak with them rather than about them, about their experiences as a post-colonial geographer. And so my book, Disarming Doomsday, formed one endpoint for this kind of multifaceted and ongoing approach.
So you call yourself a radical geographer. What is radical geography?
Really good question. It sounds quite dramatic and exciting, doesn't it? But actually, it's kind of taking from old socialist and old kind of sociology terms, almost old Marxist terms. So in the context of radical geographies and nuclear warfare, we aim to understand the social and the spatial problems that are caused by nuclear weapons and to advocate solutions. So the radical approach is committed to kind of intellectualizing, supporting, and building alternatives to nuclear warfare because it's innately pacifist. And it's well placed to create change due to this kind of position between critical theory and activist praxis. So radical geography is post-colonial. And it's against the ecological imperialism of nuclear weapons and the cultural and social and ecological harms of colonialism and imperialism. And it's focused upon kind of understanding and sharing experiences from feminist, from queer, and from BIPOC perspectives and understandings. So I think it's quite an important approach to take, really, when we think about nuclear weapons, because radical geographies addresses the fact that, you know, when we think about nuclear warfare, patriarchy and kind of hostile interactions are the predominant organs of power, aren't they? And so, you know, when you've got these kind of leaders and perpetrators that are inherently kind of patriarchal, masculinist and hierarchical, perhaps that needs to be, if not dismantled, then at least nudged. Thank you.
Do you have any particular thinkers that have heavily influenced radical geography and your work in particular?
Oh my goodness, there's so many. I love the work of Gabrielle Heck and Being Nuclear. I think her work offers an incredible post-colonial approach. I love the work of Teresia Teawiya. So she's a scholar that perhaps your listeners might not have heard of before. And she is Kiribati by descent, or she was rather. And she wrote this incredible paper called Bikinis and Other Specific Notions that directly addressed the harms caused by the Marshall Islands nuclear weapon testing on Bikini Atoll. But beyond that, I mean, I've got so many different academic influences. I don't know if I'm allowed to name friends, but Tom Davies is somebody who I work with and collaborate with who inspires me because he has a very intersectional approach. And then kind of more broadly, there's other academics as well who I think are brilliant. So Vincent Tondi is one who I particularly admire, who's recently written a Black history of anti-nuclear activism, and his work's amazing. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to shout out.
So what can geography tell us about nuclear weapons and nuclear war?
Loads of stuff. So I think it's a really useful discipline to consider these issues for a number of different reasons, actually. So you've got this inherent spatiality and this inherent geopolitic to who has nuclear weapons and who doesn't. So for instance, we can think through the 9 nuclear weapon possessor states and think about kind of maybe global north or development dominance, which is a very geographical theme, thinking through development, right down to things like cartography. So there's some really interesting maps out there. There was a particular radical geographer in the 1980s called Wild Bill Bungay, and he did this Atlas of Nuclear War. That was perhaps one of the earlier pieces of nuclear geography, and it gives these amazing, really dramatic symbologies and insights into kind of how he understood the risk of nuclear war during the Cold War. But then there's other geographers as well, like Stanley Openshaw, another classic 80s Cold War geographer, who modelled nuclear attack in the UK. And I think geography is really important because they give you this insight into spatial dimensions of nuclear weapons, but also spatial inequalities and political geography. So it allows you to draw together all these kind of different issues and different aspects. So that's why I'd say geography is particularly useful to nuclear war, because it highlights how this nuclear weapons interact across different scales, bodies, communities, politics, and mobilities.
So one of the key themes of the book is that nuclear weapons have been something that's hidden, really. So how have states managed to obscure and hide these capabilities?
I think that's another great question. So one of the things I always reflect upon is that if we develop nuclear weapons or nuclear warfare now, there is no way that the kind of progress that was made during, for instance, the Manhattan Project would be possible, because we live in a world, we live in a world that is constantly surveilled. We have remote sensing, we have satellite imagery, we have drones, we have, we're way beyond the Cold War spy planes, right? But I think it's, I think it's really, really curious, actually, thinking through that kind of particular idea. So thinking about these hidden spaces, one of the stories I always like to share is about Project Y. So Project Y didn't even have a postcode. It was in the midst of the New Mexico desert, and it is what has become Los Alamos National Laboratory. And it's really interesting how it developed, because it was this picket-fenced plutopia, if we're going to describe it in the words of another amazing academic, Professor Kate Brown. And this piece of like perfect pristine Americanism, where these communities of scientists and their wives and their children and their families were working and living and going to school or going to the park in a place that didn't even exist on the map. It was literally unmapped. And I think it's really interesting as well, thinking through like these places, because it's not just the US that have these secret cities. I mean, there's still Mercury, where I can't go now. Well, not just me, but anybody who's not a US national. I should clarify that. So these kind of hidden spatialities, whether they're nuclear weapon tests undertaken in these uninhabited places on the other side of the world that are actually people's homes, or whether it's this kind of furtive development of the technologies in place, are really interesting. And I think it says a lot about nuclear warfare, actually. I mean, obviously, there's the matter of national security during the Cold War, to reveal one's work as a nation state could have led to annihilation. It was a very serious and very dangerous thing. But when we think about kind of contemporary understandings and what archives and materials are available and what archives and materials aren't, I would urge for greater transparency personally now, so that we can all gain insights and understandings.
So we'll get into the history a bit. The key date is August the 6th, 1945, which was when the B-29 bomber dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Now, can you give us a description of what happens there and what are the implications?
So I think it's really interesting anyway, actually, to kind of think back just a few steps before we get to Hiroshima on the 6th of August. It's interesting that one of the first kind of activist actions that arose happened in July 1945, when this Lizard petition was signed by a committee of 68 Manhattan Project scientists and delivered to President Truman just 1 month before the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. However, he ignored their pleas. He bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so I think this is mired in kind of American experimentation and domination, not to be dramatic about it. I mean, the only reason it was developed in the first place in the US was because Roosevelt was concerned about a potential German atomic bomb. So, thinking through, though, what actually happened, on the 6th of August 1945, at 8:15 in the morning, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay released Little Boy above Hiroshima. What Little Boy actually was this 16-kiloton atomic bomb. So its detonation upon the city killed approximately 135,000 people. Now, I say approximately because during the detonation, ironically, the registry office was destroyed in the bombing, so nobody really knows, but it was, multiple tens of thousands of people. With Hiroshima, it was selected as a target because it was home to a significant military base, but also because it hadn't received prior damage from the significant firebombing of Japan that was undertaken before. Because one of the things that often we forget when we think about Hiroshima is that it wasn't this kind of pristine, clean environment where a bomb was dropped. Actually, Japan had been extensively firebombed before any nuclear attacks. So how did Hiroshima become chosen, though? I think that's an interesting question. Thinking through Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there was a list of suitable cities, and they were ranked on strategic value. And so what happened next is that Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not Hiroshima was originally a priority site, whereas Nagasaki was not. However, due to the weather conditions, they had 3 kind of bombing runs at another place, Kokura, that was a priority site. They had no success. So Boxcar, the bomber designated to drop that bomb on the 9th of August, gave up on Kokura and went for its secondary target, Nagasaki, instead. And of course, this had really big, really significant short-term and long-term implications.
So how significant is this event in human history? Did we enter a new age?
I think it's remarkable. I really genuinely do. One of the things that I think is most noteworthy is that whenever you detonate any nuclear weapons, you create radioactive isotopes that are entirely unnatural, that are not present in nature. And these are not, when they disperse, they're not dispersed and exposed in any kind of level where you or I would experience harm now. I wanted to clarify that, but they are present across the sediment and within the oceans and across the land, across the world through this atmospheric dispersal. And so future archaeologists may use, these events from different Cold War nuclear weapon tests to the 1945 to warfare detonations, and to kind of date and to understand where our place in history is. So when we draw upon the work of people like Karen Barad, for instance, you could define and describe this as an atomic Anthropocene. And this is what I'm in the process of doing actually right now. So I'm working with a team of academics internationally to put together, firstly, this definition of nuclear geographies, but also an edited collection called Atomic Anthropocene that kind of tells the story of our nuclear age through space, place, and time.
So throughout the Cold War, a series of nuclear weapons tests take place. What impacts do they have?
They're vast, profound, diffuse, and diverse. So when we think about the nuclear weapons testing itself, there are kind of two communities, really, I'd say, that were most at stake. So firstly, I'd say the British nuclear test veterans, the American nuclear test veterans, Russian, Chinese, there's this whole, well, Soviet, there's this whole selection of communities of people who, some were conscripted, some voluntarily joined the military services, but all participated at a low level with no authority on menial work to do with nuclear weapons and its testing. So one of my areas of expertise is the kind of experiences and understanding of the British nuclear test veterans in particular. And so I've interviewed loads of them about their kind of lives and their experiences, 150, to gain these insights. And there's this commonality that emerges whereby the veterans themselves were so excited to travel. It was in the 50s and the 60s when commercial flight was so long away. And then they travel, they witness the bombastic nature of the bomb. They experience these challenges along the way, not just radiation, but isolation, sunburn, eye problems, depression, anxiety. Some of them even committed suicide and never came back because they found the experience and the environment to be so hostile. And so there's this whole community that have kind of lived with uncertainty. They were working under a culture of secrecy, so they never really had the long-term impacts or understandings of working on the bomb clarified to them. And so now they're old men. They're old, and they have families of their own, they have children, they have grandchildren, some of them even have great-grandchildren. And for the ones that have survived, among the survivor community, there's a level of uncertainty, concern, and guilt. Because they can't be sure, because they signed that Secrecy Act, because they had no one to ask, and because they don't trust the military and to give them a straight answer about these kind of lethal nuclear weapons, right? And so it's difficult for them. And so they still undergo campaigning, they still kind of push back. There's a British Nuclear Test Veterans Association, notably, who are currently trying to gain recognition for the work that these boy soldiers, because they are on average about 18, 17, so younger than you, when they did this tremendously unusual work. And then there's the communities that I work with as well, who lived locally to the tests, who had no say. And it's very interesting when we consider the British media depiction at the time. So I work mostly with the British nuclear weapon tests, which is my area of kind of expertise and interest. But when we reflect on the British nuclear weapon tests, the places were depicted as desolate, as isolated, as wastelands, whereas often when we think about Maralinga, for instance, in Australia, which was a British nuclear weapon test site, there were Aboriginal communities there, and it was brimming with life. It included traditional routes that these communities had travelled along as nomadic communities for millennia. And this was obviously obliterated, this cultural norm was obliterated by the bomb. When we think of Kuroshimas, which is another community that I work with, the people of Kuroshimas, again, there was this appropriation of their land, what I call nuclear imperialism, where their kind of spaces were sought out, dominated, and used by the nuclear military industrial complex in order to test these bombs, demonstrate Britain's prowess, and then leave the community behind. And that this is actually part of what I also call the nuclear imperialism necropolitics nexus, which is a bit of a mouthful, but I think quite an important thing to consider, because it contemplates what happens after imperialism, after colonization. So I developed it originally while working with and exploring the impacts of Chinese nuclear weapon testing to the Uyghur community, who, as we know, are currently experiencing human rights issues and abuses. But it is equally applicable to the community of Karisimmas, who gained independence in July 1979, and since then have become a what we call a SID, so a small island developing state, but perhaps one of the poorest nations on earth. And there's this lack of development funding, lack of support, lack of awareness, and lack of opportunity for these communities who live on these low-lying islands. So I should also mention as well, low-lying islands, there's this intersection with climate change. So there's also a climate nuclear nexus going on. And I would recommend, if I'm allowed to shout out another academic, I would recommend the work of Liam Saddington, because he's recently been thinking through these ideas, and he's got some really nice, really interesting thoughts. So,
yeah, you mentioned the Uyghurs there. Can you talk a bit more about the impact that nuclear testing has had on them?
Oh, absolutely. So it's one of those communities that's kind of less spoken about, I guess, but is equally important. So I think it's really really quite shocking, because there was a series of nuclear weapon tests in this region called Lop Nor, within Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. So to give you some context, in the 1950s, before the Chinese nuclear weapon tests, the Chinese government actually put in protections for indigenous people and indigenous people's rights. So the reason I mention this now is because obviously this imperialism and this colonization of Uyghur lands and their use by the People's Republic of China for nuclear weapon tests are representative of this kind of mode of nuclear imperialism that didn't respect Uyghur life, didn't respect Uyghur culture, and didn't respect the Uyghur right to their indigenous spaces. So it's quite it's a story that again spans space and time, and these communities in particular, they went through nuclear weapons testing, they survived, and afterwards there's been a process kind of almost of encroachment upon their cultural rights. So some academics have described this as being cultural genocide, opposed to kind of genocide where you have the murder of a particular group. It's the suppression and oppression of their culture and of their cultural tradition and norms. So there's these kind of geopolitical and humanitarian issues that have arisen, and I think it's quite important, actually. I think there's an urgent need for the People's Republic of China to reflect upon current policies pertaining to indigenous people, and to ensure that it kind of doesn't perpetuate a second phase of nuclear imperialism while it kind of develops its nuclear energy, because it's undergoing a nuclear renaissance at the moment. And resources for this are included in the Yili Basin, which is in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. So it's this complex and entangled and quite interesting story, really, I think.
Can you tell us a bit about the near misses that we've had? So everyone knows about the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, but what other episodes have we faced, and how serious have they been?
Oh, that's a really good question. I'm going to need a minute to think about that for a moment, but it's a very good one. So I think I wrote about it in my book, didn't I? So there's been quite a few. So there's been problems with ambiguous data. There's been problems with defective early warning sensors. There's been misinterpretation of natural phenomena, human error, technical problems, and staff ignoring procedures. So we know that one of the first kind of Cold War near misses was during the Suez Crisis. So on the 5th of November 1956, NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, received a number of reports of Soviet aircraft over Turkey and Syria, and the movement of the fleet. And they believed that these maneuvers signaled the launch of a Soviet offensive against France and the UK and Egypt. And so they were prepared to respond with a nuclear strike. Unfortunately, all these reports were exaggerated or erroneous, and the unidentified aircraft over Turkey turned out to be a flock of swans. So I think that's kind of quite a classic, really. And this was followed 4 years later by a false alarm in Greenland on the 5th of October 1960. What happened there was that the US early warning radar equipment and fuel in Greenland misinterpreted this beautiful Norwegian sunrise as a moonrise rather, as a full-scale nuclear attack. So this kind of spectacular, sunset and moonrise was misconstrued as nuclear war. so it's quite interesting. And thankfully, the president at the time was visiting. So the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, was visiting New York, and so he encouraged commanders to quickly realise their mistake. So we know about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the impacts that it had, but there are still kind of contemporary issues. So when we think about kind of what goes on now, there's still there's been alerts in the 80s, there's been alerts in the 70s, and of course there was the Hawaiian Missile Crisis not so long ago. So when we think through the Hawaiian Missile Crisis, it was quite dramatic, really. It was this false missile alert, and so in the summer of 2017, so only 3 years ago, Hawaii resumed these monthly tests of nuclear attack warning sirens, and that was fine. President Trump must have instigated it, and it was ongoing. But this nuclear alert had been kind of put back into place, so it had this Cold War sense of dread emerging already. But on the 13th of January 2018, at exactly 8:07 in the morning, the people of Hawaii received this message. And the message read, "Ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill." Can you imagine what that must have been like? Just, it would have been shocking. And this state of emergency lasted for 38 minutes. So Hawaii had this 38-minute apocalypse in 2018, just as the new year started, until the message was confirmed to have been sent in error, and was, in fact, a drill. And I'd actually spoken to Cynthia Lazaroff, who was there on the island at the time, and she said that it is the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to her in her life. She also writes on nuclear diplomacy, and so it's worth reading her personal narrative and account if you want to learn more.
And you talk about it in the book, dark tourism and nuclear tourism. It's almost become like fetishized, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think this is fascinating. So sites from Chernobyl to Marilinga have opened up. You can visit the site of the Trinity test once a year. There's a day that opens and queues form that stretch for almost a mile. And I think there are various different motivations for this dark tourism, or thanatourism, as we might call it. And I think there's inherently this kind of interest and intrigue around what perhaps is usually secretive and unknown. We want to see what's within the bunker. We want to see what's within the exclusion zone. We want to gain this understanding and this insight into these otherwise covert places. But also, it is what Tom Davies would describe as a theatre of disaster, which I think is a really good term for it, actually. And so it's this idea that you can kind of go in, and it's almost theme park-esque. Chernobyl has become Disneyfied. You have these really eccentric materialities, radioactive ice creams, to mention kind of a more comical one, but also this kind of whole performance and experience of going into the zone. You get a white suit on, you get your mask on, you get your CVET meter or Geiger counter. You probably, not being condescending to the tourists, don't have an understanding of perhaps how to calibrate or use one specifically, but you trust that your guide will take you around appropriately and give you insights. And a really interesting account about this actually is by somebody called Nick Rush Cooper. He did his PhD while working as a tour guide in the Chernobyl tourist zone a few years ago. So he's got all these really interesting stories about kind of what happened, what the materialities were like, and how the tourists react. But I think, and I had this is an interesting thing, I had a project student this year who continued thinking through virtual tourism of Chernobyl, and she came up with some really intriguing ideas, actually. Emma Jade Hackett, hello. She was thinking about kind of these this armchair tourism, so thinking through the tourist gaze of actually not going there, not undertaking these risks, but still wanted to gain these insights, and how obviously our digital age has kind of enabled us to almost go anywhere. And it was a really interesting kind of insight, a different way of thinking about it, compared to this physical tourism. I think particularly interesting since we've just been in lockdown. So I can recommend Mike Wood over at Salford University has developed a project called Chernobyl 360 Degrees, which allows you to explore the zone. So it's well worth checking out if you're interested and you'd like to do some tourism yourself.
And why do you think nuclear weapons have been normalised? So Theresa May in 2017, on Question Time, she said that she'd be willing to press the nuclear button. So why do you think it's become normalised and it's now in the mainstream of political decision making?
That is a really good question. So it's always been part of the mainstream, but it's been shackled by what academic Nina Tannenwald calls the nuclear taboo. So this idea that nuclear weapons are so preposterous, so damaging and so harmful that we just keep them as deterrents. We wouldn't actually, use them. But I think we've become distanced by this. So in the last kind of 75 years or so, we've kind of forgotten the impacts of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and the reason why we've created these taboos. These taboos that prohibit behaviours that are not appropriate within or beyond, the moral and ethical framework of a community. And so I think when we think about kind of Fat Man and Little Boy rather exploding over the skies in Nagasaki and Hiroshima 75 years ago, the immediate consequences of these bombings were very dramatic. The survivors of these attacks are still physically, culturally, and psychologically affected by their experiences today. But 75 years is a lifetime ago. My grandparents are 75, those with kind of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and their living memories become fewer every year. So it means that the violence and harm caused by nuclear weapons could be forgotten. And furthermore, we have these populist leaders at the moment who have never personally experienced any type of warfare, let alone nuclear warfare. And they're now in charge. They don't understand the moral and the ethical significance of threatening to press the red button. And they don't think about it as civilian genocide. My argument very much is that we should invest and support and think through kinetic warfare rather than irregular warfares like nuclear, chemical or biological, because they offer the same effect without civilian harm, right? So these leaders, these populist leaders such as Donald Trump or Kim Jong-un, the dear leader, reflect on the Cold War in terms of kind of, power and glory, and without realizing the kind of international shame of these historic nuclear harms. So it's this harmful and patriarchal narrative again, that neglects to kind of reflect upon the dignity and strength of survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and their testimonies. So I think that's a really important question, actually. And I think it's really important that we do think through these nuclear issues and think very carefully how we think about things like, for instance, nuclear weapon testing, which should not be going ahead. I hear that recently the Congress, not the Congress, the House in the US has kind of voted against Donald Trump pursuing nuclear weapons testing and pursuing money for nuclear weapons testing. But I think it's really interesting because since the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, mid-1990s, we've been using simulations anyway, and we have some amazing technologies to simulate nuclear warfare. And I can say this, I am an agent-based modeler. I did a PhD that was computational science and human geography, so I know a little bit about this. And I know that the technologies that we have have available to us could include big data. They could include really precise and specific understandings and insights and very careful measurements of kind of the impacts of, let's say, new nuclear weapons. So there's no need to test them. And I think the kind of challenges that are emerging now relate back to this kind of populist, ignorant culture where people don't really understand how nuclear weapons work, let's say, or leaders don't, and don't really understand the implications of using them. Thank you. And
there's still over 9,000 nuclear weapons left in the world. Why have attempts at disarmament failed?
Oh, loads of reasons. So you've got a really good argument, obviously, for disarmament in the places like South Africa that kind of never even got to the point where they needed to disarm. They decided they weren't going to have a nuclear deterrent. But a lot of it revolves around kind of post-Cold War geopolitics, this idea that it acts as a deterrent, this idea that we'd be weaker without nuclear weapons or without nuclear warfare. You can kind of understand, I mean, the military nuclear industrial establishment, employs thousands of people around the world who arguably could be repurposed to nuclear energy, repurposed to other skills, scientific activities, nuclear medicine, all sorts of things that perhaps might have more societal benefit. I think as long as countries like the UK, which not to insult the UK, I think I am British, but we do have this legacy of colonialism and imperialism that we seem to thrive upon. When we think through kind of the role of the nation state and our British identity, so much of that predicates upon, this kind of last vestiges of empire. Whereas actually, to be a superpower nowadays, to be prominent in the global geopolitics, we only need to reflect upon COVID and to look at the leaders who are making progress, the leaders who have reduced socioeconomic inequality, the leaders where their countries are growing, and not just growing in wealth, but growing in well-being and growing in human well-being. We can look to Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, we can look to Iceland, and we can look to Norway, Sweden, all these Scandinavian countries that don't need nuclear weapons, do not get attacked by nuclear weapon possessor states, and have essentially opted out of the whole furore. So I think that kind of gradual, slow disarmament is absolutely necessary. And I think the reason why we haven't seen this sudden change is because it is a long process. I'd envisage that it could take 20 years, for instance, for the UK to disarm. But at that point, once disarmament is achieved, obviously, we cannot uninvent the bomb, but we would have no necessity for it. And I find it really strange that we think we need nukes anyway, actually. And when we reflect upon things like the Moab, where upon daisy cutters, upon these monstrous kinetic bombs that are genocidally hideous, but at least environmentally comparatively friendly. It makes you question why we retain these kind of, dated, dirty, technologies.
And what would you say to those skeptics who think we do need to maintain our nuclear arsenal, otherwise we'll be at the hands of Russia and China and countries that do possess them?
Oh, I completely understand their skepticism and I completely understand their concern. And national security is a huge issue. Like, we cannot understate, we need to be focusing on national security. And the way we are going to develop our national security is not through nuclear weapons. Bear in mind, we have a really small arsenal compared to the US, Russia, and China anyway. We've even got a smaller arsenal than France. But we're going to develop our national security by thinking through digital issues, by thinking through cyber warfare, by thinking through these leaks, these hacks, this misinformation that emerges, right? And where it arises from. And I'd argue that the new warfare, the new threat, isn't nuclear attack. So very few countries even have, first use. So it is a deterrent. It's designed not to be used as, they have no first use policies. And I would argue very much that our threats that we face are very different. We live in a post-Cold War world, and that actually would be probably astute to disarm, because just having nuclear weapons in itself, even if we don't use them, constitutes a threat from the perspective of other nation states.
And what short-term and long-term policy decisions would you want to be made over the next few years?
That's a really good question. And so some of these policy decisions are already happening. So the ban treaty was first signed on the 7th of July 2017. So it was first kind of opened for signature then, sorry. And it's progressing really well. So that gives me hope for the future. So there's currently 82 signatories. So Sudan signed literally last week. And there's 40 state parties. So that's 40 individuals who've ratified this policy. And I think it's really interesting, actually, because there's only 10 more that are needed before it comes into place. And I think that will kind of re-establish this idea of nuclear weapons having a taboo around them, if the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons does come into place, and it might create fresh impetus for action to be taken against nuclear warfare, and definitely for reparations and support to be provided for those who've been harmed by nuclear weapon testing, past, present, and perhaps future. So I'm hopeful for a future where nuclear warfare is outlawed, and where it takes its place in the history books, essentially. And I think it's very interesting. So, in the short term, if a ban treaty goes through, it might change attitudes. In the long term, and I obviously understand the need for kind of slow, gradual disarmament, but I do hope that is something that goes forward, and that we can reflect upon nuclear warfare in the same way that we think about chemical and biological warfare now. We think about gas chambers and Zyklon B in terrible terms, as we should. And so perhaps while we recognise the harms of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we shouldn't be perpetuating a system of environmental and social harm and risk.
What advice would you have for activists going forward?
That's a really good question. I love questions like that. I have loads of advice. So I would suggest that we live in a world of misinformation and disinformation. And I think one of the best ways going forward is to actually get yourself educated. So to study, to research, to learn about the challenges that are associated, whether you're interested in history, nuclear policy, international relations, or perhaps you're a human geographer, nascent, waiting to become. And to work with and collaborate and to reach out to organisations who can make a difference. So work with the UN if you can. You petition our local government, petition our national governments, support treaties that are already in place. Because one of the really interesting things is that actually we are in the minority as a nuclear weapon possessor state in the UK. We're only 9 nuclear weapon possessor states who are self-sanctioned across the world, and the rest of the world doesn't have nuclear weapons. And there are whole swathes of the world that are already nuclear-free zones enshrined in treaty within the United Nations. So there was the Rarotonga Treaty in 1986 that banned nuclear weapons and made a nuclear-free Pacific. And that's years ago, that's like 34 years ago now. So if that much progress could have been made that long ago, then just think, what you could do going forward. And a lot of this change is made through rational, I say rational, I hate the term rational, but through rational argument of the challenges that communities have faced, and through working with policy and through policy to implement those changes. I look towards ICANN, towards Tim Wright and Beatrice Finn and their work that won the Nobel Prize back in 2017 as something that any activist should aspire to.
I'm conscious of the time, so I'll finish with 2. The first one's a bit more of a depressing question. It's how likely do you think a nuclear war and a nuclear winter that would follow that war, how likely is that, do you think?
Global nuclear war, not very likely. But I do think that the consequences with climate change would be extraordinary. So what would happen now compared to what would have happened 30 or 40 years ago is different. And there's an amazing team of researchers, Alan Robock et al. I'm going to say Alan Robock et al. Because he's got like a whole collective of people who've been working on nuclear winter alone and modelling it and simulating it for decades. And their most recent paper showed how climate change compounds the effects of nuclear winter. So when I mentioned this climate nuclear nexus earlier that I was been thinking through, this is actually another one of the issues. It goes from nuclear winter to actually the impacts to the dignity and autonomy of people who live on these islands. So I hope nuclear war doesn't happen. I don't think it's very likely, but I think that there's this whole legacy of past, present and future harms and entanglements that need to be addressed, from the health challenges and difficulties of the uranium miners who've extracted materials, whether it's in the west of America in the 1940s, or whether it's thinking through the Nairobi-China connection now, and the perhaps unethical processes around uranium extraction for weapons and energy that are being undertaken. Like any kind of industry, there is this chain of globalization and this process that creates spatial inequalities and creates human rights issues as well. When you're dealing with something as toxic as uranium, you need to have protections in place. So I don't think there's going to be a nuclear war immediately. I think, and I hope that Donald Trump and Kim Jong Un are posturing, but I don't think it's wise, because I think the more it becomes normalized, the more it becomes acceptable, and the greater that likelihood does increase.
And I'll finish with this one. How optimistic are you that we're going to reach a situation where the whole of the world is free of nuclear weapons?
I'm actually quite optimistic. I think that it's realistic, and when we think through, as I mentioned earlier, we only have 10 more ratifications to go, right? 10 more ratifications before the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons comes into force. And I think that's going to change things quite dramatically. And while I hear these arguments about the difficulties of disarmament and the challenges of removing an industry, perhaps, I think it's a necessity. And I think that the majority world, these communities who've been affected by nuclear warfare, whether it's the Marshallese Islanders, the Kiribati Islanders, the people of Kazakhstan who lived in the polygon and were subjected to 456 nuclear weapon tests, the people of Lok Nor, all these different communities that have been affected, would very much argue and are very much pushing for this abolition to arise. At the end of the day, one of the things we need to think about is that we are supposed to be technologically advanced. We're supposed to have better solutions now. We're supposed to be geopolitically evolved. I think that eventually this recognition that nuclear weapons are dirty, dangerous, and dated will be seen, and perhaps things will change.
Okay, on that positive note, I think we'll end there. Thanks very much for coming on.
You are very welcome. It's been a pleasure, and good luck with the rest of your series.
Thank you.